There are times when we have experiences that exceed our capacity for presence. It exceeds our capacity to process something fully, where we don't yet have the ability to extract all of the deep gifts and lessons. So you mentioned my father being killed and
murdered, yeah.
Murdered, and so almost 30 years later, I'm still learning deep lessons from that. And so because of this, we need to have a shadow vehicle, which is essentially a phrase that refers to the mechanism through which we take something we can't process and extract its deep meaning from instantly and take that and put that somewhere else.
Welcome everybody to another episode of Integral Edge. My name is Keith Martin Smith, and I'm the author most recently of When the Buddha Needs Therapy. I work as a developmental coach and as a developmental editor. Very excited today to have my good friend Alexander Love on. We've spoken a few times on this channel. And Alexander's an acupuncturist, a developmental coach and facilitator. He serves as the director of curriculum development and senior facilitator at the Newfield Network, which is an international coach training and personal development organization. He's also the creator of the Lumina process, which is a shadow work modality that integrates shadow work with Eastern wisdom and integral theory. And that's a big piece of what we're going to get into today. He's currently not only writing, but just about finished his trilogy, Evolutionary Gestures, which weaves developmental theory and Eastern philosophy with magic realism and memoir, including the story of his father's murder and the restorative justice dialogue he later held with the man who took his father's life. I've read the book. It's very, very good and very, very interesting. And today, he and I are going to explore really the sort of how the foundation of the human mind gets started between basically infancy and toddlerhood, and how this really leads to the creation of the shadow vehicle that we negotiate really for the rest of our lives. And I'm really excited to explore these topics with you. So welcome, Alexander.
Well, thank you so much, Keith. It's great to be here with you and everyone. I'm just happy to be here and dive in together.
Great. So shadow vehicles, you work as a coach and you do a lot of work around trauma and shadow, and I've done a lot of work with trauma and shadow, and I've had to do a lot of trauma and shadow work in my day. So maybe just start us off at the beginning, right? How does shadow get imprinted into the human animal? Like what does that mean?
Yeah, beautiful. So, to begin with, we can look at the human being as one fluid whole. One gesture that's sort of the extension of the rest of the cosmos, this process that's been unfolding for quite a long time. And the thing is that we all have discovered in our life is that there are times when we have experiences that exceed our capacity for presence. It exceeds our capacity to process something fully, where we don't yet have the ability to extract, at least the way I look at it is there are moments where we don't have the ability to extract all of the deep gifts and lessons. So you mentioned my father being killed and
murdered, yeah.
Murdered, and so almost 30 years later, I'm still learning deep lessons from that. And so because of this, we need to have a shadow vehicle, which is essentially a phrase that refers to the mechanism through which we take something we can't process and extract its deep meaning from instantly and take that and put that somewhere else, imprinted in our system in such a way that it's in hiding, in shadow, so that later when we have more capacity, we can step by step, bit by bit, moment by moment, tier by tier, we can really learn the deep lessons that are kind of hidden within that pain.
Right. Okay. So it's obvious, looking across the whole animal kingdom, including humans, that, that mammals get traumatized, right? A dog can be severely abused or any animal, a farm animal, right? And they'll carry that trauma, if you will, sort of in their externalized behavior, being aggressive or being timid, those sorts of things, behavioral implications. I think, a lot of us are familiar when we see like two dogs get into a tussle and start to fight, and they separate and then they shake it off, and their mood sort of instantly changes. And maybe you could just talk a little bit about that process of trauma unfolding into the body in a mammalian sense, and then what makes it different with a human mind.
Yeah. Well, maybe I'll start with the second part, which is what
Great.
makes it for us, because I think when we unpack what this shadow vehicle is, the first two aspects of it have some earlier pre-human sort of aspects, some aspects that will kind of get to your question. So I guess I would begin with saying, what's unique with all of this with human beings is we're walking through what I like to call the sacred gap. The sacred gap is this distance between the knower and what is being known. We have the capacity for reflection. We can have an experience and then reflect on how that experience has impacted us. And of course, the nuances with which we can do this, develop as we grow. But this is one of the things that is unique to humans. Yes, some animals do show some capacity for witness and witnesser, but so far it doesn't seem to be as sophisticated as what human beings can do. And so we're traveling through this sacred gap that gives us a sense of division. It gives us a sense of separation. I mean, when a dog is experiencing a trauma, there's no distance between the trauma that's imprinted and their sense of identity. They can't say, oh, I'm cowering in the corner because last week that other dog ran after me and I'm still holding an imprint of being scared. They're just reacting and responding. Right. Human beings have the opportunity to do something a little differently so that we're able to, in time, reflect on what these things mean about us, these ways in which we hurt one another. And we have the opportunity to, on the one hand, collapse. On the other hand, we have the opportunity to turn that into something deeply beautiful.
Well, to collapse or to lash out too, I would imagine,
yes,
right?
Exactly.
Certainly
collapse, lash out.
Seem to do one or the other for the most part. Or I guess we've got the freeze thing sort of too, or the fawn, but okay, so it almost sounds like you're saying, from a certain sense, that there is sort of a foundational and original trauma, if you will, in the sense of like there is this sacred gap between the knower and the known. There is even if we have an extremely exceptionally great childhood, there is the trauma of living in this human body with this human mind and feeling this split between the knower and the known. Am I understanding that correctly?
I don't know if I would call it an original trauma.
Yeah, well, I was being intentionally good Christian in my framing there.
We could look at it as an original trauma. We could look at it as an original gift. We could look at it as a next opportunity for blooming that is coming from billions of years of cosmic creativity, where for the first time, there's this cleave is an opportunity for the cosmos to look at itself and say, what am I? What am I doing here? What am I for? Right. What is this about? And then at some point, as we grow, take conscious action to do something about whatever we conclude. So I would say that it's sort of a unique gift of the, we could say human realm, although there may be other beings we don't know of that also have self-reflection. So I don't want to leave that out, but
sure,
largely it's a gift of this human world that also gives rise for trauma.
Right.
And the need to store such trauma so that we can ask these deep questions over a lifetime rather than getting so fried that we're, unable to function in the world.
Okay, so from that angle then, is the idea that both traumas both trauma in the sense of maybe neglect or, abuse or whatever, and this sort of sacred gap, that they both are potentially gifts. It's really a matter of how we understand them and how we learn to look at them.
That's my experience.
Okay. So
I mean, I think, yeah,
go ahead.
I think there's there's many ways that we respond to our experience of tragedy. We can respond to our experience of tragedy by attempting to preserve our innocence. There's a way in which we can use various, teachers, teachings, higher authorities as a way to sort of try to protect us.
Or escapism, right?
Well, yes, it can be a form of escapism.
Or what should I say? Maybe a less noble escapism, maybe drugs and porn and power. Or,
Yeah, sure, exactly. So there's a way that we try to preserve innocence, and then there's a way in which we can drop very deeply into the sting of tragedy, where we are feeling deeply, we are brought to our knees, and the sort of innocent world that we were trying to preserve, it comes apart. We can no longer keep some image of some kind of idyllic, if I just meditate enough, or if I just do what God says or what the book says, I'll be fine. There's a way in which the tragedy cracks through all of that.
Sure.
And then there's something that comes after that. We might call it the post-tragic, which is it's our capacity to turn back towards tragedy, but from a deeper orientation from wholeness. And we're not leaving tragedy behind, but we're embracing it so closely from an unbroken dimension of being that there's another possibility that starts to emerge. And this is where it becomes natural for us to see these traumas in our lives as gifts. When we're sort of under the burden of tragedy, maybe feeling broken ourselves, it can be very hard to see the gift in a traumatic experience, in a tragic experience. And in fact, if we tell someone this is such a gift in that moment, it usually doesn't land so well, because that's not how it feels to the broken heart.
Sure.
But in time and with practice and community that supports orienting from wholeness, it opens up a possibility for re-encountering tragedy in a new way.
Right. So in my experience, then, it's sort of like you have to become a victim before you can let that identity go. You don't get to go around it. So like in my own trauma work and quite a few of my clients, it's like first you have to realize that something happened to you that was unfair and unjust, and that it did victimize you, and that it did create patterns in you that are creating patterns in your life, and that in a very real sense, that isn't your fault. Like that's the genuine victim. It's like, hey, I didn't ask to be hit, and it created this coping strategy, which is very maladapted to an adult life. I'm a victim here. I'm going to own that. And then the next step, of course, now some people get stuck there, which is a real problem, right? And there's a whole sort of culture around being stuck in the victim place. I know you've certainly had to swim in that culture, and I've had to swim in that culture. But ideally, and that is the tragic point of view, right? I'm a victim of this, and I've lost something because of it. And then you move on to where it's like, oh, the person who did this to me, it wasn't their fault any more than it's my fault that I've been acting the way I've been. It's not about fault anymore. It's just about responsibility and about the gifts that come out of it. Like in my own experience, it was having this tremendous compassion that opened up for the trauma of my family, and seeing that like, oh, my mother had a terrible childhood. She was abused as a child. It was terrible. And then like, this total opening for compassion towards her, independent of me, right? And so it really helped this huge healing and this connection, and she and I to heal and bond over it, and lots of cool things. But so maybe you could speak into that dynamic a little bit, and maybe tie it in a little bit to some of your experiences with your dad.
Yeah. Well, I think we also see what you're describing in the hero's journey. It's a every good story, I won't say every, many stories that resonate deeply with our human psyche begin with a kind of idyllic world. There's this sense of everything is going well. I've got the good this and I've got the great that, and I'm living in the kingdom and eating all the food or whatever. And then there's a call that we usually avoid. And there's something about the moment when we are either make the choice to enter that journey or are forced into that journey, that we begin to encounter experiences that break our sense of innocence. Or another way to say it is break our sense of everything is fine given what I know. And then this takes us into that domain of tragedy, of that domain of having our hearts broken, of something breaking apart, essentially. Mm-hmm. Now, of course, writers will mess with this journey because they understand the arc of it. Of course, then there are helpers along the way, and then we arrive at some sort of transformation or a series of mini transformations, and then we arrive at a culminating transformation. Sometimes at that point, not always, the hero or heroine returns back home, but they're now returning from a different perspective, and they're carrying the wisdom of having interfaced with tragedy and difficulty, and we could say overcome it. I might say more closely from the view that I'm inviting is that we become more intimate with it.
Yeah,
it's not so much that we're overcoming. We're actually still allowing it to break our heart open, maybe even every day. But it's cracking us open into a place of deeper wholeness, deeper luminosity that gives us a new perspective on both the idyllic world that we maybe started in or tried to create through belief structures that would kind of insulate us from disaster, as well as new perspectives on this, the experiences that we've gone through. So they get reinterpreted, but not just intellectually. They get reinterpreted through a direct place of contact from the heart. Yeah. So, I mean, that really lands the idea of, we're not leaping over, we're integrating what happened in the past. In my experience or my language, I might say metabolizing, so that the traumatic wounds from my childhood are still present, but my relationship to them is radically different. And so when that trauma response arises in my body, one, I often recognize it, and two, it leads to very different behavior than it would have 20 years ago. It's a calling to slow down and sort of look in and actually be like, oh, there's something here that requires my attention, that requires consciousness, that requires slowing down, right? Because it's never about the person that's doing the triggering, right? It's never about that. So yeah, maybe just walk us through a little of your personal story there, Alexander. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So, I was trying to relive the 60s. This was in 1998. I was trying to relive the 60s with my friends, and we had a beautiful high school junior, senior year where we spent time in the woods and playing music and creating art and loving each other. And then I went away to college for a couple years to music school in Boston. And that's where I received the phone call that my father had been murdered. So he was a lawyer. He was also a Zen practitioner, and he was a lawyer. And he was working for one of his clients. He won a case for one of his clients, but the person that he won the case for owed money in back child support. And so the court system withheld his winnings. Now, he interpreted that as my dad just stole his money because he didn't understand how the system worked. And so he hired 3 young men. They were probably 19, 20. They hired 3 young men to go to his office where he was there with, my father was there with his assistant. His assistant was about my age, about 20, and was the fiance of my sister-in-law. My dad had been recently married. So my dad is newly married. Her daughter, this was her fiance that was working with my dad. And so they went in and they had my dad write a check for, I don't know, $5-some thousand. And of course, so then the check bounces because, well, it didn't bounce, but the bank wouldn't give them the money because for whatever reason there was a flag. And so they came back and then they murdered him. They were planning on killing him anyway, so it wasn't really because of the check. The instructions when they were hired by the mastermind was leave no witnesses. They gave him a gun. They gave him telephone wire to tie them up, and that was the instruction.
Got it. So were they both murdered?
Yes, they were both killed.
Okay.
Yeah. And now Herbert, who was the one who pulled the trigger. So basically, there's 3 guys. 2 of the guys leave. Herbert goes and kills both of them. Then they go out and they buy shoes with some money they stole from my dad that he just had, on his pocket. So, receiving this call as a 20-year-old, right. that was a breaking point. I had a privileged childhood. My parents loved me. I had great friends.
Right.
And this sort of was a shattering moment. I was also prone towards positivity. It was just part of my disposition. I'm more of a above ground sort of, flower thing rather than like some of us are like these deep sea creatures, and it's like, I'm sort of just like, that shiny, sunny thing. And this really, it really fractured,
Sure.
Created some fractures.
Of course.
And then started a whole journey of discovery. And
so for you, this was the sort of beginning of the dark night of the soul, or the descent into the underworld, in really kind of a literal way, not even a metaphorical way.
Right, exactly.
And like everything began to collapse, the positivity collapsed, the view of the world collapsed, and I would imagine you were thrust into a period of intense doubt.
Well, I was first thrust into shock, and
Sure.
then into doing everything I could to transcend the pain and remain positive, because that was my natural disposition. So that's what I leaned into as sort of as someone who didn't know about shadow work, hadn't seen a therapist.
Sure.
I didn't know all those things. So I automatically just leaned into what I was already kind of good at, which was positivity. But
fake it till you make it kind of thing.
Yeah, but I didn't have tools,
Yeah.
I didn't have tools. And so I eventually found, a spiritual path that was really good at transcendence. And so that's what I did for a number of years
the classic bypass.
Right. The classic bypass. The path was like, this place is nothing but suffering. That's the only thing that is here. Your job is to get out of here.
Yeah.
And I was like, great. And so, it was more of a trying to go to that pre-tragic.
Right. Trying to get back to the purity of trying to forget that the world is a place where your father could be murdered for basically no reason.
And then what would happen periodically is I would watch a movie about gun violence. It was either a shoot 'em up movie or something like that. And I would just find myself weeping uncontrollably, yelling at a God in the sky that, I didn't have a conception of there really being a God in the sky, but I was so angry.
Sure.
Like, how could God make this happen?
Right.
And so that, there was moments of both transcendence and then thrust into that, that place of the tragic sting.
Right. Well, it wasn't. Well, was it a transcendence without an integration? Was it a genuine transcendence, or was it a false transcendence?
I don't know what you mean by that exactly, but it was genuine in that it was contacting deeper spiritual states.
Okay.
But contacting deeper spiritual states doesn't equal shadow integration. And there was a whole belief structure around it that was more like, okay, this teachings are going to tell me everything I need to just get out of this place.
Right.
Rather than the reflection, hey, your desire to get out of this place is actually a sign of psychological distress. It's
Right.
not necessarily the yearning of your soul for the beloved. Like, yes, that can be there too, but on top of that on top of that deep desire for union, there's this psychological distress that's saying, get me away from the pain. And that, that's where it eventually led to this exploration of shadow work. And
Right. And because, I mean, especially if we go in the Wayback Machine, it's very complicated, right? It's like, there's from some of these traditions, there's real truth in the idea that, like, well, that experience was a construct. It isn't really real. You're carrying it with you. It's not happening now. You can, and I mean, Landmark has some of this too, right? You're not being raped now, so like, just set it down. It's like, well, there's truth in that, right? There is some power in that perspective, and you can inhabit that perspective to some point if you're really stuck in the trauma and unwilling to work with it or let it go. But it's such a both and, right? It's like because it's true that you can begin the process of setting it down, and you can't set it down and never pick it up again. I think that's where things go off the rails with some of those paths that don't have psychological wholeness as part of their path of integration.
that's right. Well, I mean, we can set it down intellectually, but our body didn't set it down.
That's right.
Because that requires something else. And so I wonder along those lines if it would be a good moment to kind of unpack this sort of shadow vehicle a little bit.
Go for it.
Because it'll sort of give us some clear sort of markers to how this process is happening in us.
Great, yeah.
I want to start by saying that some of what I'm going to share is inspired by what I've learned from Kim Barta. He was my first teacher in the domain of shadow work, and so I'll try to be explicit where we diverge or sort of talk about it differently, and more importantly, sort of what I learned in what I'll share from him, so it's clear for the listeners. But we can begin with saying that, okay, if there's this whole human world where we are walking through this sacred gap, and as we're developing from a developmental perspective, we could say that the first 4 waves of development form the structural ground of the human psyche. So if we're looking at Terry O'Fallon's model, there's 12 waves of development. We can say that the first 4 are really the ground of the human world. At the same time, we can look at these first 4 waves of development as being a place where different aspects of the shadow vehicle come into being. And one way to look at this is to explore this notion of evolution's engine. So evolution's engine we could look at in terms of the evolutionary impulse. And evolution's engine is comprised of 5 permutations, or what I like to call the 5 evolutionary gestures. The first evolutionary gesture is going to help shape the first wave of development. The second evolutionary gesture is going to shape the second wave of development, the third, and so on.
Right.
So we can look at this evolution's engine and these 5 evolutionary gestures in the context of developmental stages or waves, which you and I have looked at before a little.
Sure.
But we can also look at it through the lens of shadow, the shadow vehicle. This is the deep structure, the mechanism in our psyche through which shadow is formed. And so with that as like an intro, is there anything else that you want me to mention before we just kind of take a look at some of the details?
Maybe just, I'll remind you if you don't, but maybe towards the end, tie in your ideas about how this process becomes self-aware. So maybe just tie that in towards the end of it, but let's get into the actual meat of it for now.
Okay. So Kim Bartow was the first person that I learned from who was aligning aspects of shadow processes with the emergence of a particular developmental wave. And so he taught me that the first developmental wave, in Terry O'Fallon's model is 1.0, is where introjection first appears. And this makes perfect sense because the first developmental wave, 1.0,
which is the realm of the infant.
It's the realm of the infant, the newborn, the infant, up through maybe 18 months-ish, give or take. We are in a predominantly receptive state. We're predominantly in a receptive state. And in this receptive state, we are absorbing our entire world. We're absorbing our entire world. And there is not much ability to filter. We can't say, no, I don't like the way my mother's talking to me, so I'm going to set a boundary.
Right.
We haven't even conceived of this as a mommy yet, right? In this first developmental wave, it's like everything is kind of misty and fused together, kind of like an ocean or water.
Sure.
And so with that, we're absorbing everything, and this is the beginning, the first part of the shadow vehicle is the capacity for introjection. It might be interesting to note, this will give us a little bit of some symbolism around what introjection is. I've been deeply informed by Chinese wisdom and Chinese medicine, and so I often draw upon Chinese characters to help me understand things because they are beautiful in using symbols. Now, while the term introjection was created later in the Chinese language, if we look at the origins of the characters they chose, they provoke some really interesting things. So when we look at the Chinese character for introjection, the first is a character that basically means inner. So there's like entering a territory, but you're entering sort of an enclosed territory. So it means inner. The next character, it means to manage or absorb. And it shows 3 ears and means to whisper. It means that someone is listening intently next to a hand that's implying grasping or control. So we can understand that there's some implications in the early symbolism in this character for introjection, that there's this sense of submissively absorbing the whispers of authority.
And maybe before we go any further, just briefly define introjection versus split off selves to give people a context if they're not familiar with that term from a psychodynamic point of view.
Exactly. So imagine that you're absorbing these whispers from an authority that is wanting to grasp or control, right? You're absorbing this into your deep interior, and you're taking it on without a digestive process. Right? So someone tells you real men don't cry. Real men drive trucks. Or the way that your parents are caregiving when you're younger, their anxiety, their distortions, their love, all of those things are being absorbed without a conscious digestive process. We take it all in.
Right.
The good and the bad.
Right.
So that would be how I would describe introjection. It's not automatically shadow. I remember my daughter when she was little. She's very tiny. Her family is from Chile, and they're sort of shorter humans. And so she's off, and I'm not that tall either. And so she was often very little, and so I would often tell her stories and things about like this little mouse that was strong and fast, but it was really little. And one time I put her on top of the refrigerator, which for her, it's like so tall, now she's looking all over. and I had her repeat after me, I'm a powerful woman. I'm a powerful woman. So she repeated after me, and she's absorbing that. That's a social introject or a familial introject. But in that case, it's aligned with a deeper truth inside of her wholeness. I didn't say, repeat after me, I'm gonna be a doctor. Right? That's a different, it's a different communication. So introjects aren't automatically shadow, but the point is that the first part of our shadow vehicle develops introjection, which is an aspect. It can be positive, but it's also a way that that first element of shadow forms.
Yeah. No, the doctor thing's making me smile because like being raised Irish Catholic, it's like my Jewish friends were told like, so do you want to be a doctor or a lawyer when you grow up? And the Irish, it was more like, so you think you can become a doctor or a lawyer? You think you're better than your brother and your uncle?
That's right. Exactly.
Very different introjects, right?
Exactly. Exactly. So this is the first. The key here is that the underlying evolutionary gesture is wholly receptive.
Right.
And that's what enables our system to develop that first aspect of shadow. Now, there's one other component that forms here is the shadow vehicle, and that is latency. Now, we'll learn later what repression is, but repression, the way I'm defining it, it requires a certain amount of volition. I don't want this, I am pushing this out. That develops a little bit later along our shadow vehicle process. Okay. But latency is the early ways that a young baby, or your question about a dog, dogs that are fighting, there's a way that our body will absorb the trauma in a kind of, it's almost like, imagine you're dropping dirt into a body of water, and somehow it's able to settle at the bottom or sort of be kind of enfolded. What I want to be clear about here is there's a kind of a gentle absorption into latency, which is a very different gesture than stable, strong, I'm going to not feel this, right? Because a baby can't do that.
Sure.
So those are the two first aspects of the shadow vehicle. The latency is something that I'm kind of adding. Introjection is what I learned from Kim.
Okay.
Yeah. Anything about that before we go into number 2?
Go to number 2. Take us in this vehicle of shadow.
All right. So now, the gesture of 2 is this first experience of sacred gap, actually, for a human being. There's a first division. We could call it splitting apart. So what we'll see is that, for example, someone in what in Terry's model would be called 1.5, we might understand in the integral language as a kind of a red sort of territory. There is the ability for, I am now able to visualize concrete objects that are out in the world. So yes, this starts to happen as I transition out of that first wave of development, but it's really, starting around 2 years old-ish, depending on the circumstances, where I can start to visualize mommy as a thing inside of me. I can visualize the cookie that I'm desiring. I can visualize daddy. That is a way that we own the world, but also begin to differentiate the world from this diffuse kind of, everything is sort of misty and ethereal. Right. I'm able to start to have this distinct thing. So this enables me in general to begin internalizing a differentiated world. And along with this, we could say, whereas the first evolutionary gesture is water-like, the second evolutionary gesture is more fire-like. There's a power, there's a raw fire that comes online that is what is behind the force to exile. The same capacity to split, these early divisions in our psyche, these early differentiations in our psyche, also has this power behind it that can say, I don't want that. And this is going to be, now we don't really, this second wave of development doesn't really repress. It doesn't really have the capacity to, it's not really good at impulse control. If you piss me off and I have a baseball bat and I want to hit you with it, I'm probably going to hit you with it.
Right.
But it's an early force.
Right. Well, in like a 5-year-old, it's the temper tantrum that, right. You know,
that's right.
The meltdown about, you know, you have to come home now, and
yeah,
histrionic response, if you will.
Right. And we'll be able to use this power later for repression.
Aha. Okay.
Okay. Now, the other thing we can say is that this splitting apart is also a precursor to an inner family of parts.
Uh-huh.
That's going to come up more fully. Yeah, it's going to come up more fully in our next evolutionary gesture. But this is, you could say this is like a precursor. We have to have an ability to visualize mommy, an ability to visualize daddy, an ability to visualize dog, in order for later, as we can be more reciprocal in our experience, in order for us to be able to have an inner family and inner system. First, there's differentiation before they are all in relationship to each other.
So this splitting apart, right? You know, I'm curious if you've looked into or have any thoughts on if you're living in a more of an indigenous culture that is more integrated, or you could argue fused. It would sort of depend on which position you wanted to take.
Yeah.
Like I know Dan Brown talked about how the ideal parent visualization, which helps to resolve attachment wounding, it didn't have to really be done in Tibet because there actually wasn't an attachment wound, because when the split off process begins to happen, it's folded into a cultural wholeness. Am I making sense? Does that question make any sense? Okay.
Yeah. So to be clear, splitting apart isn't the shadow itself. So like as we're looking at the shadow vehicle, we're looking at the structure of how shadow can be created in our system. Okay. So splitting apart, I guess it sounds sort of bad, but it's not. It's really, we could use the word differentiation. So in an indigenous culture, the young child is still learning how to visualize in a more differentiated way.
Yes.
And if there was a traumatic experience, could then be a force that has to be there in order for a split or an exile to occur. But the fact that we have that mechanism in place doesn't mean that it is shadow. It's more the structure of how shadow forms.
I understand. It's the vehicle, not the people riding in the vehicle.
That's right. Exactly.
Yeah.
So we have this aspect of, we could say, the second evolutionary gesture. Okay. But there's one other aspect, and it's this second aspect that I've learned also from Kim Barta, which is projection. Aha. Remember we said that this second evolutionary gesture is this motive raw fire, this cosmic power that starts to foreground in our system, and it's barreling through us, and we don't know really how to do anything but just let it, make us hit things and explore things and all kinds of stuff. Now, projection is essentially a loss of power, where I am taking the power that is in me, and I'm projecting it. I am the movie projector.
Right.
And I'm taking my power and I'm throwing it at the movie screen.
Right.
So that now I see the problem that I've split off and disowned, and now I've thrust it onto an object, an it, out there, and saying, okay, you're bringing up this notion of victim and aggressor and that territory. This is where I disown something from myself. I use power to thrust it onto the movie screen, but now in doing so, I've lost my power, and this shows up as blame.
Right. It can also show up in the golden shadow way too, which would be idealization, or in a therapeutic context, maybe even a healthy transference.
Right. Exactly. So again, I'll share the Chinese symbols for projection, because again, I'm very interested in gesture and because I think it takes us out of our thinking mind, which I'm not against thinking, but it brings us into a symbolic mythopoetic kind of landscape so that we can find this in ourselves. And so we see, again, the Chinese characters for projection, they are a more modern creation. But if we look at their originally some of these images are etched onto oracle bones. And so we find these early pictograms that can offer us a lot in terms of our sort of mythopoetic understanding. And so we have a hand that's grasping a sharp weapon or a hammer and throwing it at an enemy. All right? And then this is placed to another character that originally showed an archer's bow that's launching an arrow to hit a distant target. So we have this image of you're throwing a hammer or a weapon at an enemy, or you're shooting an arrow to hit a target. It gives us this beautiful imagery around the disowning of our power. We could call it the projective loss of power. So together now, our shadow vehicle, the first evolutionary gesture that arises with the first wave of development, this includes introjection and the capacity for fluid, unconscious latency. The second evolutionary gesture that shapes the second wave of development, this gives us projection, the capacity for projection, as well as splitting apart. You can't project on somebody else unless you have a division of a me and an it.
Right.
Right? The top two quadrants in Ken Wilber's 4-quadrant model. You have to have a split. This is the beginning of the sacred gap.
Right.
There has to be a me and an it. You stole my cookie. It's your fault that I'm sad. Like that.
Okay, great. So now we have the three kinds of shadow that Kim Barta has defined, which is introjection, projection, and split off selves. At this point, as we near the end of wave 2, the vehicle is formed.
No, not quite yet. We've got two more to go.
Okay, I'll be quiet. Keep going.
So in Kim, the way that Kim Barta talks about it, as you mentioned, there's introjection, there's projection, and then there's these split ego states. Yeah. Now, Kim Barta places that as arising in the third stage, which would be 2.0 in Terry O'Fallon's model. I am suggesting that in the second wave of development, there is a precursor to those split ego states. There has to be the ability to split off, but those parts of the self, our system isn't quite sophisticated enough yet to have those parts interacting with each other as a system, as sort of a family. And so when we get into the third stage, or the third wave of development, which is 2.0, this is governed by and shaped by the third evolutionary gesture,
which would be like early amber, just for people that...
That's right, early amber. And this would be, the central gesture here is reciprocity. It's a movement between. So you see, in 1.5 red, I have the capacity to split off and say, I don't...
It's your fault that I'm not happy.
Exactly. Yeah. But in 2.0, now these parts of us are going to have greater facility to be able to have a more sophisticated internal capacity to keep shadow from feeling like it's overwhelming us. Okay? And so here is where we get the parts trinity. This is something that Internal Family Systems has done a great job at drawing out. We have the guardian parts, the protector parts, and then we have the parts that are exiled. Now we can exile with a powerful force that we learned in the second evolutionary gesture, but now in 2.0, there's more of a capacity for our system to try to keep that hidden. It's like, this is where we could say also the precursors for repression start, although we see in 2.0 specifically, it's hard to keep things staunchly repressed. If you hang out with a young kid that's moving through 2.0, they're quite emotionally volatile. Those quote unquote exiled parts are going to be flying out all over the place, but you'll also see more developed protective mechanisms that will start to come online because of that wave's sophistication and capacity for reciprocity between these inner aspects of our system. I want to be really clear, though, 2.0 is not going to be aware of all of this. We're talking about the foundation of the human world and how the shadow vehicle is formed. That doesn't mean that there's going to be self-awareness to recognize all of these things at those moments.
Yeah, like in the Robert Keegan language, this is all subject, none of it is object.
Right. And so we have here with the parts trinity that arises in the sort of the third evolutionary gesture. I'll say if the first is related to water and the second is related to fire, the third is related to wood, which is understood. It's like a tree. It's like, think about a tree is the intermediary between heaven and earth. Or the idea here is that it's basically in the yin yang symbol, it's the wiggly part in between yin and yang. And so when they say wood, what they're talking about is this median space that allows the yin and the yang to interact, or the active and the receptive to interact. And so the way that this shows up in terms of the shadow vehicle is through what we could call a parts trinity. We have a yin guardian, a yin protector, we have a yang protector, and then we have the exile that they're protecting. Yin guardians tend to show falling apart gestures. So scrolling on the internet for hours, eating the whole cake, doing the drugs to check out.
Right.
These are kind of we also will sometimes see like binging and cutting and burning and those kinds of strategies to try to, basically we're losing control and we're falling apart and trying to go into a kind of a numbness. Okay? The yang protectors, they tend to exert more control. These are in IFS they call them managers. I like to call them the yang protectors just to give a broader category rather than like an archetype. But you'll see, the part of you that makes yourself not eat the whole cake. The critic in your head that says, do it like this, otherwise it'll prove you're a loser.
Right.
It's when, a big tragedy happens, and at least I see this in the US, where they're like, just keep on going, don't stop, don't let them see us grieve, show them that we're fine. That's that sort of yang protector. And so we now
sort of the archetype of the British there, chin up and off you go.
Yeah. What is the phrase my dad used to say? You just have to grin and bear it.
Right. I mean, I literally heard a thing. You remember the bombing of the tube way back when, 20 years ago or whatever. I think it was 7/7 for the British. But I heard an interview of a woman who was saying that, she was on the tube when the bombs went off, and she came home and her husband said, look, you have to go back to work. It doesn't matter how afraid you are. Chin up and off you go. And she said, and so I did. I went to work, and I was like, that's terrible advice, But that's exactly what you're saying. And it makes sense if the Germans are invading and it's the Second World War. There is a time and a place for not being overwhelmed by your internal anxiety, I suppose.
Now, one of the things we want to keep in mind is if she had access to the number 4, to the fourth evolutionary gesture, then she would be able to do that with a lot more stability and repressive continuity. 2.0 is going to be, they can try, right? Their protectors are starting to develop, but they're also prone to volatility because they're still had by their experience in a different kind of way than what comes next.
Right.
So to review, the first part of the shadow vehicle includes introjection and latency. This is governed by the receptive evolutionary gesture. Mm-hmm. The second aspect of the shadow vehicle has projection, as well as the ability for splitting apart and exile. This is governed by that cosmic fire, the second evolutionary gesture. And then the third is where we really get the various parts, where Kim Parta talks about the split ego states. And we get these various parts. They're starting to form early clusters of protection to keep the most vulnerable aspects of us maintaining and creating world-facing strategies. You use the word maladaptive. They can be maladaptive or not, but often these maladaptive strategies, so that we're able to function in the world. Maybe in the moment it was exactly what we needed to survive.
Yeah, I think they can become maladaptive.
They become maladaptive over time.
They're quite adaptive. Yeah.
Exactly. So it's both is there.
Yeah.
And so that's the first three steps, the first three aspects of the shadow vehicle.
Okay.
And then unless you have things you want to explore there, we can go to the next one.
No, so just developmentally, we're in the early amber, which is for the typical Western adult, that would be when they were like in their, sort of, 10 to 13-ish, 9 to 13, in that.
7, 8, 9, 10, 11. It depends on the.
It depends, sure.
It depends on the circumstances, but, roughly speaking,
I think it gives parents a place to sort of look maybe at their kids or nieces and nephews and get a sense of like, oh, okay, next time I'm at a family gathering, maybe I'll look to see if I can see the third wave sort of in action with Sally.
If you want to, like a solid way to do it would be to find an 8-year-old or a 7-year-old. When we get into 10, 11, 12, middle school, depending on the environment, there may be some early flashes or moving into some of the next wave of development. So because it's a little more nuanced there. It's like if 7-year-old, 8-year-old, even some 6-year-olds, depending on who they are and their disposition and how they've been brought up, you can see it there pretty solidly.
Great. Okay. Yeah. Why don't we move on to the fourth wave?
So the fourth evolutionary gesture is governed by what we could call, to use Chinese medicine sort of imagery, if the first is water and the second is fire and the third is an intermediary wood, the fourth is metal. There's a structuring. There is a relationship to organization, stability, structure, and systems, right? And so what starts to happen is the inner system of this person's psychology begins to develop even more complexity. So we mentioned the parts trinities, the parts trinity in previously. Now imagine clusters of parts trinities, right? There's a way that the defense mechanisms can get more sophisticated, and this is where we develop repression. Now, of course, we try repression in early amber 2.0, and sometimes we succeed, sometimes we don't. 1.5 red, we can't really repress. It's like there's the impulse control just isn't there. Maybe we can try because we want what we want and we're told we have to do it, but then it's going to come out. But now in solid amber 2.5 in Terry's model, we have repression and the ability. Yeah, go ahead.
So is this like in like pack therapy, for instance? Is this why, when they bring you in as a new client, they spend the first great deal of time, hour and a half on tell me what you remember from 0 to 12. And what you do or don't remember. So like for me, it was like, I don't remember basically anything from 0 to 12, like these like flashes of sort of non-memories, which for them is a potential red flag of repressed trauma. Yeah,
absolutely. And I'm making a nuance here that maybe we don't need, but because I'm looking at from a view of the waves of development, I'm making a distinction between latency and repression. We could easily, and I'm sure some viewpoints will, put repression, maybe they just will include it all in one category. Because I don't really believe that a newborn represses something,
Sure.
yet things can be unconsciously made latent. I hold a different kind of definition there. It's open to conversation, but it's a differentiation that makes sense to me based on how this shadow vehicle is formed.
Mm-hmm.
And also 2.0, early amber, can begin to, they have more of a sophisticated capacity to protect themselves. So early repression does come online there, absolutely. But this is the kind of thing where I'm rule-oriented. I want to do what the teachings say. I want to do what my parents say. But then there's moments where I just can't help myself and I have to do it. Uh-huh. And then that red 1.5 takes over and I just do the thing. It's like at the end of that movie, is it called Chocolat?
Yeah.
Where at the very end, the guy that's like really repressive towards everyone else the whole time, at the very end, he's trying to get people not to eat this chocolate.
Right.
And at the very end, he's seen in the Chocolatiers storefront, passed out because he ate all the chocolate. Right. He finally wasn't able to repress anymore. 2.0 has a harder time keeping that repression down. 2.5, sort of, you could say, solid amber, is better at it. Right. And so that's why I'm languaging it here.
Yeah.
Even though
and to be clear with the pack thing too, that's one angle. The reason I said could be repression is there's a whole nother school of thought that says the way some brains develop, sort of in the years after when puberty onsets, that it actually, in some people, it just sort of deletes the earlier files. It's actually not about repression. It's more about just the way the brain, that particular brain, grows up. And it's very tricky to tell the difference between the two, right? It's not necessarily an easy path. And to presume repression is a potentially very dangerous path.
Yeah, absolutely. And a lot of the early traumas are nonverbal. And so we don't remember because we don't have the symbolic linguistic register with which to make contact with them. And it requires a much more subtle set of skills to be able to make contact with that.
Yeah, I worked with one guy who we made contact with sort of a very old, very young trauma. And it was great. He was like, don't make the mistake of trying to have a conversation here because there's no one to talk to. Yeah. Right? It's like you had the conversation has to happen in a very different way.
Yeah, absolutely. So maybe, in keeping with the pattern, I could just talk a little bit about the character for repression, because again, I think it reveals some really cool symbols here.
Sure.
So on the left, again, I feel like I need to say this because when I work with scholars that help me, they get a little upset when we use modern characters but draw upon their evolutionary origin. For me, it's totally fine. And when I talk to native speakers, they love it because it shows the wisdom in their language and history. But I like to just offer the clarifying point that the characters for repression are a more modern creation. And we're looking at, despite that, we're looking at their sort of original imagery. So on the left, the character, there's two characters. The one on the left, it shows a kind of like a landslide or the collapse of a wall. There's a sense of being buried under heavy weight. And if you look at that character further, there's actually a sense of internal pressure from eating too much. This is actually what the characters show. Internal pressure from eating too much delicious dog meat. And
I thought you were going to say chocolate.
No, yeah, right. You're stuffed. And you're also surrounded by this earthen building that has collapsed. So there's this sense of pressure and weight. Now, this is next to, so it means that character means to subdue by force or keep under control or restrain. Now, the other character, this shows a hand or a claw that's forcing someone into kneeling. It means to suppress. Aha. And there's one interpretation that I found that it's suggesting when ancient governments were forcibly branding the foreheads of outcasted criminals as a mark of exile. How is that for some imagery, right?
That's talk about public shaming. That's next level.
Exactly.
I guess you got to hope you can bring the bangs back. That's your only hope,
That's right. Exactly. So feel the difference here between I've got a couple parts of the self in early amber. I've got
Yeah.
a couple parts of the self that are trying to protect me and trying to keep things suppressed, but sometimes they fly out. The difference between that feeling and forcibly branding something an exile,
Yeah.
and it's a very different feeling. And we see this in Amber 2.5. There is a profound capacity for this metal-like stake in the ground. I will live the way I have said I will live, and we do not feel X, Y, and Z. I will throw that into the dungeon, never to be spoken about again. We hear these stories of people where they're like, oh, my grandfather, he had all these experiences in the war, but he never said one word about it.
Right.
Can you imagine, us postmodern humans going through something that intense, and like all we're going to want to do is talk out loud to everyone all night and all day? And so we have, in this fourth evolutionary gesture, we have both a greater sophistication in the inner system of parts that helps us in this firm kind of capacity for repression. And so this, we could say, is the fourth aspect of the shadow vehicle. So you see how we're building out.
Sure, and here we're at mature amber, Terry's 2.5, Bob Keegan's 3.0, but the idea here is that it's mature phase. We just look at historically and look around us, right? It's like organizations and people that are operating from this with a high level of maturity for that level are masters of repression. I mean, masters of repression. That's the Mormon Church, the Catholic Church, the Baptist. A true and blue Islamist, right? It's like there is good and there is bad, and the bad you just deep six it, you destroy it, you annihilate it inside of you, you pray it away, you pray away the gay, all these things, right? It's repression.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So you're going to see that differently than like in an 8-year-old.
Right. Or are the right, or like the people that, the way I understand that Terry's described it, the adults that are in the 2.0 phase as an adult, they sort of have to go back to, say, the minister all the time to be reminded what the rules are and to sort of spool up the repression engine because they have a hard time holding it on their own. And so it's easier for the preacher to tell me, you're a sinner because of this. And I go, oh, that's right. Yes, thank you. I am a sinner. Right? Because I don't generate it internally as well.
Exactly. And so what we'll see is that, and then I'll experience shame, that's something that arises in 2.0. I'll experience shame. I'll experience embarrassment. I wanted to follow the rules, but I didn't follow the rules. But in a shadow perspective, we can apply this to, there are certain things that are too painful that I want to keep hiding. Now, some of them are deep in latency, and I'm just not going to see them because my system is wise enough to not let that happen. But we can also see a volatility where there may be exiles that fly out. We think about, anybody that has a relationship with younger children. It's like if they just feel a little safe, and they get triggered, that defense mechanisms, they just collapse and out comes all of the stuff, right? Whereas 2.5, you could see this in young teenagers, you can see that they have a vulnerability that's triggered and they're like, nope, I don't need to talk about it. And you're like, but honey, I see that you might need to talk about it. Do you want to hug? Nope, I don't want to hug. They have more capacity to wall off internally and from their exterior in that act of sort of, now, 2.5 amber is, you could say, is using that 1.5 power, that red power, not to hit somebody with a baseball bat, although that also happens, but that's another conversation. But they can use it as a power behind the repression.
Sure.
So now I'm channeling that raw power into something that's much more measured.
And channeling it inside as sort of a self-abuse, if you will, or self-control, that sort of thing, yeah.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
I mean, I know, like in my experience being raised Roman Catholic, it was this sort of, as I was getting older in my 20s and 30s, it was always like when someone would, tell me something negative about myself, and I would be like, is that all you have? I mean,
right.
that's it. I mean, what I'm saying to myself is like an exponential level higher than that. So like, I mean, you're not even close to impacting me
Yeah,
because
exactly.
that voice had gotten so
That's
refined, right, through those systems.
Now, there's one more piece that I just want to mention briefly, because there's 5 evolutionary gestures. And the 5th evolutionary gesture is the gesture of transition and interdependency. And so we can talk about these things as separate. You know, there's the first one, the second one, the third one, all of these separate aspects of the shadow vehicle. But we can also talk about how this 5th evolutionary gesture, which is what transitions us from one tier to the next, it's what transitions us from one wave of development to the next. This is the gesture of, I like to call it, it's all of everything we just talked about, it's all of it rolled into one in an interdependent, dynamic engine of evolution. I like to call it the evolution with the revolution with sprouts. Okay. So the revolution is the enfoldment. In Ken Wilber's language, this is the inclusion, the agapic embrace. And then the sprouts is the transcendence, the ability to move into a new vista. So we have evolution's engine is this revolution with sprouts. And it creates transition itself. What enables one thing to become another thing so that it's a continuous movement? That is what's underneath interdependency, the thing that makes everything one fabric, one whole. And so this is the sort of the final aspect, you could say, of the shadow making vehicle, which is our capacity to move through transitions seamlessly, our ability to transcend and include, which very often we don't do that so well. We either transcend and reject, or we get an inkling of something new, but then we fall back into the old thing because it's so compelling, or our culture says no one will love you unless you stay here, whatever it is. But we can also see this in the context of shadow, as this is the mechanism that from the beginning maintains this capacity to enfold our living history. Everything we've experienced since the dawn of time, maybe even if there's no dawn of time, everything we've experienced for forever is enfolded consciously, unconsciously, and subconsciously. So that every moment that we've been focusing on the unconscious aspect of it, every moment includes every previous set of experiences. That gives us the opportunity, when the time is right, to apply shadow work practices and learn how to do it effectively, so that we can find these repressed aspects and these aspects that are hidden deep in latency, that are maybe nonverbal, and bring them to light so that they become these sacred gifts that we discover along this gap of, I like to call it the sacred gap of awe and wonder. Yeah.
So is the idea there that the 5th wave is which would be early orange, or something like that?
It's not a fifth. It's not a 5th wave. It's the in between.
Okay.
It's the gesture of in between, and the gesture of everything working, everything we just described, the whole shadow mechanism.
Oh, I see. Okay.
The whole shadow mechanism is one interdependent. It's not like introjection, projection, parts trinities, repression. It's all one interdependent whole.
Sure.
And it's really the space in between. What happens in Terry's model is then, after these 4 waves of development, the transition foregrounds until then we go into the second tier. The subtle tier is what she calls it, at which point we start now at a new octave of 1.
And to be clear, not the second tier in the integral sense, but the second tier of the stages model, which would be early rational. Yeah.
The second world space that is comprised of 4 more waves of development. We now have the same evolutionary gestures. They iterate again, but now at you could say a different octave.
Right. Okay. So to bring this all home then, as far as the work that you're doing, and you work therapeutically with people, and you live in this intersection of trauma and development and agency and self-expression. And so, the people that are listening, how do you use this in a way that it actually comes alive?
Yeah, so the way that I work with this is through the Lumina process, which
Yeah.
is something you mentioned in the beginning. And
Yeah.
this is a modality of parts work and shadow work that integrates everything that we just explored here together, but then also many other aspects to learn how to work effectively with our shadow dynamics from a place of wholeness, or we could say post-tragic wholeness.
Uh-huh.
And so that's what brings all of this to life. It comes to life in the practice.
And then, when you work with people, are they sometimes partners on the path? Or are they sometimes, given their own capacity? How does this work line up with people's internal capacity, what they can see versus, what they can be taught versus just doing the work itself?
Well, I mean, there's two different territories here. In terms of the people that are interested in learning, like the people that are still listening to this conversation that we're having, right? I typically don't teach everything I'm saying to you in the context of a one-on-one coaching. What I do is I teach the Lumina process, where we go through the level 1 of the Lumina process is a 3-month cohort experience where we go take a deep dive into some of what we talked about here, but also a lot of other things. And I follow in the style of, we learn a certain set of distinctions, and then I walk the cohort through a practice together. So it's almost like we're pointing out various aspects of our interior, and then that builds on itself as the course goes along, so that by the end, people have the skills, like in the 3rd month, people have the skills to be able to go in and then, for example, we'll do a specific practice that works with attachment issues in 1.0 and, other issues that arise in 1.5 and themes that occur in 2.0 and 2.5. We just focus in the first 3 months on we touch on the first 4 waves of development from a shadow perspective.
Got it.
But that way of doing it allows people to really get it in their body and direct experience.
Got it. Okay. So just to sort of tie up some loose ends here, what is your relationship to the murder of your father these days?
Yeah. My relationship is that I feel closer to him, his essence, than ever. Herbert and I had a conversation 3 years ago, was our first conversation. We've had about, I think, 8 total. We have our upcoming conversation we're going to have. Last year and this year, I scheduled it on the anniversary of, I usually would say on the anniversary of my father's death, but it's really the anniversary of my father being murdered and Herbert's life changing in huge ways. I mean, he went to prison for life. Right. He spent the first 4.5 years in solitary confinement, where he had an hour, of daylight that he could be out in. And so our relationship has deepened, where I would consider us friends.
Okay.
And the attempt to, you mentioned the Evolutionary Gestures trilogy. I'm just completing the first book of the trilogy. The second book is mostly written, and the third is waiting for later. But this writing has been a process of going more deeply into the painful, tragic aspects of this experience that I had ever felt in the previous decades. And it has been an experience of turning that into art. To me, certain aspects of good art, there's many kinds of art, so I'm not putting it all in one category, but there's a certain kind of art that has the courage to go into the tragedy and show the beauty.
Yeah.
So that where we would normally have the impulse to turn away,
yeah,
it's so beautiful, we come closer. But then we have to encounter the tragedy.
Yeah.
And then we're left with this kind of friction between beauty and tragedy.
Yeah.
And I think that is a way where, through a different sort of avenue than the intellect, we walk closer to this post-tragic possibility.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, I appreciate that the relationship with Herbert, is not so simple as, I forgave him, or something which is fine, and people sometimes need to, that's as far as they can get in their healing journey. But, because I've read some of the book, disclosure. It's much more seeing him in many ways as a victim of his own circumstances, and someone who, from a certain perspective, it wasn't his fault from a certain perspective.
Exactly.
Right? Although it is his responsibility, right? Just like it's your responsibility to deal with it. And
exactly.
And it seems what I'm saying is you've met him just so beautifully in the realm of that reality, of that complicated reality, of that nuance that allows there to be a real relationship that isn't excusing anything, and it isn't making him responsible for things that are unrealistic either.
That's right. And I mean, within the first 10 seconds of our conversation, it was clear that there's goodness in this man.
Sure.
And he wants to do good, and he wants to keep living, and he's been living. And, it's an opportunity to love somebody and to have a real conversation, rather than just say, here, I'm going to label you as the villain, and that's it.
Yeah. Or the one who's been forgiven, and good luck rotting in prison.
Exactly. Which isn't really forgiveness, right?
Kind of not, yeah. Yeah. It's a beautiful lesson there. I mean, for me, I see so much of things these days through the lens of the polarization that we feel towards each other. And to me, you being able to do that in such an extreme way with so much beauty and grace and learned experience for both you and Herbert, it gives me hope that the polarization and the polarity that we are existing in is really just a matter of doing some of these things that we talk about, that actually leaning into some of these edges, bringing some of these things into awareness, and being able to track things like projection and introject and split off cells, and what's actually possible once we understand this deeper evolutionary impulse that's moving through everything.
Yeah. As you're speaking, what comes up for me is like, if you look out in the world, you meaning me, all of us, if you look out in the world and you don't see art, how come?
Right.
And what's required for us to look closer? Because again, good art doesn't make it all look like roses and daisies. I mean, some of my favorite art, my wife's an artist, Veronica Love. By the way, if people want to see what I'm describing, veronicalove.net. She has some beautiful images that are disturbing, and they're some of my favorite.
Sure.
And so it's like, if we look out into the world and we look at what's disturbing, but we don't see the art in it, how come? Where are we looking from that makes it look differently? And what do we need to do in ourselves to be able to look close enough that we still see the tragedy and we still respond with the heart of an activist, or, the compassionate action, like all of that stuff. We're not trying to just like make things okay and like then go back to eating too much. It's like to really be able to stay with the pain.
Yeah.
But see the art, see that it's art, that there's something beautiful in it.
Yeah, and there's cinema and there's shows. I just recently saw the I think it was the Netflix show Baby Reindeer, but it was such a beautiful meditation on turning, sort of a grotesque level of pain into art that was just soul illuminating. Just a beautiful. It's our relationship to this pain and to this human experience that in many ways defines us. And to your point, it's the invitation to the deeper grace underneath in this post-tragic viewpoint. That's right. And I think, we're talking about it in art, we're talking about it in cinema. I also see it in some forms of comedy, where it's like, Jon Stewart is a great example of this, where it's like, he's not making light of it to dismiss it. He's making light of it so that we can digest the gravity of what he's speaking. And that, I think that distinction is so important. It's like when I say seeing the beauty in it, this is like, it helps us digest the gravity of whatever the it is. 100%. 100%. And it helps not make it something that exists outside of us, because from a certain perspective, nothing exists outside of us. So it's another, that's a different conversation, but it's another form of projection ultimately. And, you know, from a Zen perspective, we would say the world is as it is, and it could be no other way. So why are you resisting anything? Because it, right? And it doesn't mean you don't fight for change and you don't fight for insight and you don't do all these things, but the foundational relationship is different because it's from a place of foundational acceptance for what is, because that's just, what other choice is there? To resist what is? Okay, well, good luck with that. So, Alexander, it's been a wonderful conversation. I've really appreciated it. Any other hanging thoughts out there that we need to close the loop on that you see?
No, I think we covered it. I will just mention that I'm starting a new Lumina process cohort in the first week of April at the Newfield Network. So if folks are interested in diving deeper, we can put a link in the liner notes or something to like
Sure.
a free course or something that people can kind of go a little deeper into if they want. And also they can check out the Lumina Level 1, which I think is going to be a fantastic group.
And if they wanted more information or they wanted to get in touch with you, how would they do that?
Yeah, so they could go to the Newfield Network would be one
Okay.
way, newfieldnetwork.com. They can also go to, I think we'll put in the liner notes a link directly to the Lumina Level 1
Great.
where there's more information there, so they can just look in the notes and find a way there that way.
Great. All right. Well, it's great seeing you again. I always enjoy our conversations. They're always very interesting, very deep, very soulful.
Thank you. It's lovely being here with you, and it's lovely being here with everybody that's here with us.
Great. And thanks again, as always, to Corey and Rob for making this possible. All right. Thanks, everybody.